Okay, delegates, we are on Principal Report Section 5, Northern Ireland Building the Peace. We're calling on the Assistant General Secretary Peter Bunting to introduce the Northern Ireland section, Building the Peace Report. Also, there will be a PowerPoint presentation during Peter's presentation. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Chair. Chair, Minister, comrades, once again I have the privilege of introducing the Northern Ireland section of the Executive Report. I wish that the news I bring was better, that I could be more optimistic for our society and the prosperity and security of the people we represent, that our communities were at ease with each other, and that our elected rulers were dedicated to the progressive betterment of all who live in Northern Ireland. I wish that I could tell you all here today that 17 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, that the pledges made at that time by the politicians were honoured, and that Northern Ireland had not become a political football for parties in Stormont and, for that matter, in Dáil Éireann. When I last addressed this gathering 2 years ago in Belfast, I declared that the trade union movement was the opposition to the enforced consensus from Westminster. That consensus was that the economic deficit was the gravest crisis we faced, and that the only cure was austerity heaped upon austerity. The Tories have just been elected on a manifesto they had never dreamed of having the chance to impose on the country. It was a right-wing wish list, even far right by European standards, and was designed to be their opening round in the event of negotiating a coalition administration. And now, as everybody knows, and nobody expected, they have a majority in the House of Commons and the backing of a rabid Tory press to do the following: to reshape employment law in Great Britain to ensure that it will be virtually impossible to go on strike, and even then to open unions to unlimited claims by any passing complainant; to legalise scab labour by allowing agencies to supply strikebreakers; to bankrupt unions by removing the check-off system of union subs; to shrink facility time for union activities such as representing members and encouraging union learning; to make political campaigning by unions as difficult as possible, thus attempting to silence us further. All of this building up to their ultimate goal, the removal of the United Kingdom from the European Union and its progressive labour legislation. They want to go even further, removing the UK from the European Convention on Human Rights, obliterating the Human Rights Act, a core component of the Good Friday Agreement. This only bolsters our determined campaign for a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. On top of that, they wish to open the NHS and education provision to private operators, outsource public services to the preferred providers, Circle, Capita, A4E, and cut taxes even more for the rich. But the major change is their ideological attacks on the marginalised and the working poor under the guise of welfare reform. Northern Ireland is currently being held ransom by the Tories and their welfare bill. Here are the real facts about welfare. I'm going to show you a few slides. The first one you can note from the curve in economic terms on that particular slide is that the spend on welfare has been continuing progressively over a long period of time. But you should also note that there are no huge spikes in that slide and in that curve. And the UK spends 200 billion per year on welfare. The next slide, I hope you can all read it, puts a lie to the fact that the Tories and those who they wish to attack the marginalised are the main recipients of welfare. As you can see from that slide, 40% of all payments on welfare in the United Kingdom go to pensions, senior citizens. 14%, the next highest, is for tax credits, and 12% is for housing benefit. You will note that there is not a huge component of that welfare spend being paid out to those who are stigmatized by being apparently or allegedly scroungers and people who don't want to work. It is, I think, very instructive that you realize what's happening here in the welfare attack on the working class and the marginalised. The next slide exposes that cruel lie that people, again, who are on housing benefit are victims as well. Because you can look at that slide and note that housing benefits has seen a significant increase by over 20 billion pounds in the last 10 years. Why do we have housing benefit? We have housing benefit because we have no social housing. We have housing benefit because the rich landlords put up the rent every year upon year upon year. And that's why we have 20 billion pounds of spend. The next slide shows what we have termed tax credits. Now, tax credits in the United Kingdom are the same as family income support in the Republic of Ireland. And you will note the huge rise in that spend, where we are now subsidising unscrupulous employers who won't pay their employees a decent living wage. That particular part of welfare should be called employers' welfare benefit. And you will see the huge increase in that over the last number of years as well. And the interesting thing about it, the reason for that can be exposed as a huge explosion of low pay right across the United Kingdom. But there is one slide which I've probably jumped over. But what it does, again, illustrate to you is that the number of recipients of tax credit hasn't changed in the last 20 years. It's still 5 million people. Sorry, that's the housing benefit. Sorry, housing benefit. So that's the interesting thing I think you should know about welfare. But let me come back to the tax credits, because they were and they are a good idea. And tomorrow, George Osborne, in his July the 8th budget, will attempt to make the lives of the working poor worse, because his intentions are to tax credits. And the problem is that the situation of low wages needs to be challenged. The state is subsidising starvation wages by employers and overvalued rents through housing benefit. The figures are quite mind-boggling and occasionally emerge. Last week, Tesco plc held its annual shareholders meeting in London. There was a mild revolt at the 4.1 million remuneration packet for its new CEO, Dave Lewis. But all went well, and the City of London block vote carried the day as always. Part of the rebellion by some Tesco shareholders was Tesco's low wages. There were demands that Tesco pay the living wage, and then this figure was revealed: £364 million. That is the amount that the UK taxpayer spent on tax credits for Tesco workers last year, according to the campaign group Citizens UK. More than £250 million from the state every year to subsidise a company which had a stock market value of 14 billion before its recent difficulties caused by its incompetent and hugely overpaid management. In fact, Tesco, Asda and Sainsbury's cost the UK taxpayer well over 700 million in subsidies for their low wages, which helped them post profits of 3.8 billion between them. There are only two things that can improve the lot of the underpaid, and neither of them are cuts to tax credits or housing benefit. Those two things which we require to improve the lot of the underpaid are state action on a living wage and collective bargaining. Comrades, we have a fight on our hands, and we can win this fight. Do not listen to the voices of despair who tell you that the odds are too high and that nothing has been or can be achieved. This movement has led the opposition, was vilified for doing so, has delayed and even stopped the worst plans of our opponents. If it was not for the trade union movement standing strong and united, Northern Ireland would be a far worse place for ordinary workers and their families. The entire neoliberal fantasy embedded in the Stormont House Agreement would have rolled out. Welfare cuts for the disabled and working poor, asset sales of public land, privatisation of public utilities, mass redundancies across the public and private sector, and a huge cut in corporation tax for big business at the cost of further reductions in public services. All of the main parties were signed up until someone shouted stop. That someone was the collective voice of this movement, travelling across Northern Ireland and speaking at over 30 public meetings and dozens of union branches, phoning into radio programmes and making noises on Twitter, writing letters to local newspapers and badgering elected politicians. We organised protest rallies and public meetings, highlighting the destructive impact of cuts on local communities affecting health, education, public transport and other vital public services. There were other struggles too. Some we lost, brave fights, such as that to maintain the driving licence agency in Coleraine. But one outcome of these local campaigns in Mid-Ulster, on the north coast of Antrim, in South Down, in West Fermanagh, is the daily proof to people who are not members of our movement, realising what a resource to the entire community a strong and active trades council is, how important local trade union branches are to everyone in a town or a village, not only union members. Comrades, we stand with the victims of racist attacks in Belfast as we stand with the victims of power, be they Colombian and Bahraini trade unionists, South African miners, or the children of Gaza. But we are, most of all, the collective voice of our members. On March the 13th this year, many took the ultimate step, a massive strike across all sectors, with thousands filling the centre of Belfast, making clear to the political and media and business class and the overseers in Dublin and London that what was prescribed as the ideal future in the Stormont House talks was not in our name and not in our interest. That dispute is ongoing and will intensify in the autumn. Almost every public sector union has a mandate for some form of industrial action, up to and including strike action. We remain resolutely opposed to the economic and social cost of the Stormont House Agreement and will continue to oppose it regardless of fantasy budgets or backroom deals in Stormont. Stormont House did not address what it was supposed to deal with: the legacy of the conflict, the trauma of the conflict, and the consequences of the conflict. In Northern Ireland, we have the highest suicide rates in these islands, 70% higher than any other region of the United Kingdom. And we also have the lowest paid workers right across the United Kingdom. At the beginning of the whole debacle last December, we submitted to all parties and the three governments a paper which identified 6 reasons why Northern Ireland requires additional funding and not austerity. The 6 areas affected by what we call the troubled premiums are mental health problems. 1 in 6 in Northern Ireland are affected. And most of those, by the way, are concentrated in areas allegedly called or close to the peace lines. Poverty and deprivation, which is persistent and intergenerational, deepened by 40 years of conflict. Security, the most expensive policing in the United Kingdom because of the unaddressed blight of sectarianism, which has led to decades of underinvestment and is reproduced in part by the segregation in our education system, a multi-tiered complex which segregates at the age of 4 by faith and class by 11. Then there is the social cost. 80% of Protestant boys on free school meals leave school without any usable qualifications. In all of these statistics and categories, Northern Ireland is placed among the worst in the United Kingdom. These are the crises that need to be addressed, and Stormont House did not deliver. This month, we will still have massive sectarian tensions and the real chance of sectarian violence because there is no agreement on the causes and the consequences of the conflict from which we are still slowly emerging. Stormont House, welfare reform, transforming your care, a fantasy budget, a deficit crisis. All of the above were portrayed as crucial for rebalancing the Northern Ireland economy. What a nonsense. It was left to the trade union movement to put forward the alternative. So we produced 100,000 copies of a newspaper and sent it to workplaces, community centres and other public places. Following the General Secretary's initiative on the Congress Charter for Fair Conditions at Work, we launched the Northern Ireland version last week. 2 weeks ago, a new concordat with the student movement initiated by the ICTU Youth Committee in Northern Ireland and NUS-USI, the representative body of over 200,000 students in Northern Ireland. Part of that agreement is to work together to deliver training for youth and student activists in organising on campuses, in workplaces and in our communities. 3 weeks ago, we worked with Amnesty International and the Rainbow Project to deliver the largest demonstration ever in Northern Ireland for civil marriage equality for all of our citizens. These are the tasks we do, promoting equality, decency, education, and the power of collective actions in workplaces and in our society. We have other allies, some in political parties, as well as our friends and members in every community, and our comrades in the trade union movement in England, Wales and Scotland. We have our arguments fashioned by Neary and other hands and minds in our movement. We have to deepen our engagement with the membership of this movement, develop the next generation of activists, shop stewards, health and safety officers and union learning reps who will stand in the way of those who wish to drag our society backwards. Comrades, we will lead the resistance to the Tory plan to destroy that which makes our people strong and our society civilised. Every core value of this movement is an obstacle to the Tory plan. We stand for fairness, equality, prosperity, opportunity and justice, the hallmarks of the Good Friday Agreement in words and in spirit. Our business is the unfinished business of 1998. Let us complete this task. I commend the support to conference.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that comprehensive report. I'd now like to introduce and call as our guest speaker Jennifer McCann, Junior Minister of the Office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland. Jennifer, take the stand.
Can I just first of all start off by thanking John and Peter and the rest of the Congress for giving me the opportunity to come today to speak to you. I know that Martin McGuinness, the Deputy First Minister, was supposed to be here, but unfortunately couldn't be here. And I suppose the agenda for this conference highlights the deep and divisive impact that austerity continues to have across these islands. The austerity agenda pursued by the British government at Westminster and that of the Tory lights in Leinster House offers nothing but misery to the people throughout Ireland. In the north in particular, where we have already had 1.5 billion slashed from the block grant, we are now faced with the prospect of even further cuts in the region of 25 billion in the time ahead. And we are likely to learn of those further cuts tomorrow when the British Chancellor George Osborne delivers his budget. This attack on the most vulnerable in society and on public services is unnecessary, it's unjust, and is totally unacceptable. These proposed cuts would impact on everyone in our society, and not just on the unemployed. Their impact would be felt in public services, jobs, tax credits, benefits for those in low incomes, and by older members of our community also. In the 26 counties, the implications of austerity have been felt everywhere. Public services and welfare were cut, new taxes imposed, workers' rights reduced, wages and hours cut. And as a result, we've had hardship, poverty and inequality increase. And young people have left these shores in their thousands in search of work elsewhere. And that is what austerity looks like for people. It is not some alien concept talked about by economists, it's real lives of real people. And that is why Sinn Féin have been to the fore in opposing austerity right across this island and in Europe. And in the north, where I'm a junior minister in the office of the First and Deputy First Ministers, we have blocked the welfare bill and the cuts that the Tories demand that we impose on communities. Our position on austerity is clear. We remain totally opposed to the Tory cuts agenda in principle and in practice. It is an anti-community agenda and it is an anti-democratic agenda. We have a mandate to oppose cuts and we intend to use it. And we will not be part of any agenda of cuts imposed on our communities at the bidding of a cabinet of millionaires who have no mandate in the north. The Tory government and its supporters within sections of political unionism, together with the pro-austerity economists and elements of the right-wing media, continually tell us that we simply have to accept it and that there simply isn't any more money. But they are wrong. There is always more money. It is a matter of how that money is spent and what governments do with it. The British government and the unionist parties publicly claimed before the recent Westminster election that they want to see 2% of Britain's GDP being used on military expenditure. David Cameron has absolutely no problem spending $23 billion to replace the Trident nuclear submarines while cutting the same amount from public expenditure. So there is clearly money in the system. As the great stalwart of the left in Britain, the late Tony Benn, said, if they can find the money to kill people, they can find the money to help people. The British government's current economic and political strategy and ideology is in fact incompatible with the Good Friday Agreement and the process of democratic change that underpins the peace process itself. They also tell us there is no alternative to austerity, and they are wrong about that also. The public here do not want austerity. They have made that very clear. Sinn Féin stood on a platform of anti-austerity in successive recent elections and received 500,000 votes. The Tories, by comparison, failed to retain their deposits in the constituencies in which they stood in the north. And it is not just Sinn Féin and the Labour movement in Ireland and in Britain that is saying austerity is wrong. Increasing numbers of eminent economists worldwide are articulating the view that austerity is a flawed economic strategy. And there is a clear alternative to austerity, and support for that alternative is growing. In Dublin, tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest against unfair and unnecessary water charges. In London, up to 250,000 people recently took part in an anti-austerity protest addressed by my party colleague Martin McGuinness. And a similar demonstration took place in Scotland at the same time. And of course, the Scottish people have shown their total rejection of Tory austerity with their support for the SNP. And most recently, the people of Greece have led the way in opposing austerity and set an example in their support for their democratically elected leaders in the face of attempts to impose that hardship from Europe. Closer to home, there are many organisations and groups in our society who are opposed to the austerity. Churches, community groups, and of course the trade union movement continue to be at the coalface of the campaign. And the task facing us today and now is to build a united and cohesive campaign, bringing together all strands of opposition to the cuts agenda so that we can speak with one clear voice against austerity. It has long been our position that we must use our collective strength to confront and confound this current Tory government and their disastrous agenda. We need to see a nexus between the Irish Labour movement and the Scottish, Welsh and English TUCs, and I want to acknowledge the ICTU's efforts in beginning that process and for their constant support for the peace process. The alternative to austerity is investment and growth, equality and prosperity. It is workable and sustainable finances for our political institutions and a fair recovery for all. The reckless adherence to austerity by the British government is threatening our chances of recovery. It is also threatening the future of the political institutions in the North and the huge progress that has been made over the last 2 decades of the peace process. In fact, the approach of the Tory government at Westminster presents the biggest threat to the political institutions that we have seen to date. The determination of the British government to stick to its Thatcherite policies in jeopardising the future of the power-sharing institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. Those institutions are now at risk, and the Tory government is gambling with the future of those institutions as part of their crusade against the vulnerable and against public services. Both the British and Irish governments have a responsibility to stand up for the Good Friday Agreement and the institutions that create it. The Irish government in particular, as a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, must work to ensure the institutions have a workable and sustainable budget to deliver for all in our communities. People that we represent do not want to see the institutions collapse. They recognise the value of locally elected and accountable representatives working to improve the lives of all our citizens. And their view has to be heard, and more importantly, their view has to be listened to. The voice of those people and of the trade union movement and of all the groups who oppose austerity must be heard by the British government. And I would urge everyone in civic society, those in the business community, the voluntary and the community sector, the churches and the trade union movement, to come together in a positive alliance to defend our communities from the cuts agenda and to stand up for public services and to defend the democratic political institutions. There is now an opportunity to challenge this disastrous agenda, and we must seize it to create a fairer and more equal society for all. And I just wanted to finish off by saying, I've been around talking to a number of different organisations, different individuals and different groups in civic society over this past period with other colleagues in the party. And I really have to say, we more than ever need to get together and to create that alliance going forward. And I want to say, I want to continue to work with people and to work with other progressive forces right across this island in the weeks and months ahead, because really, I can't emphasise enough the risk to the political institutions at the current time. And again, just to thank Peter and John and everyone here for giving me this opportunity to address your conference today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jennifer, for that contribution. I'm going to call on John Douglas, the President, to make a presentation to the Junior Minister.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the main agenda again, and motion number 6, Peace, Progress and Equality, on behalf of the National Executive Council. Calling Brian Camfield to propose the motion.
President, Conference, Brian Camfield on behalf of the Executive Council to propose motion 6. I'm going to say that the Good Friday Agreement was really an historic compromise in 1998, following decades of violence, death and destruction. And it was a recognition that the problems of Northern Ireland would only be resolved through dialogue, through mutual respect, and building equality across all the community. But we're also promised in Northern Ireland a peace dividend. We were promised economic improvement that would redress the injustice of unemployment and social exclusion and deprivation. And despite in 1998 having the peace settlement, it has staggered from one crisis to another, and it's been threatened by various controversies relating to flags, decommissioning, symbols, marches, and a whole range of things. But who would have predicted that it was austerity that would pose the most deadly threat to the political institutions and to the peace process? Because that's the way in which it's shaping up at the moment. This most indicates strong public sector and a social security system makes a critical contribution to equality. It's a major, public services are a major equaliser because it gives everyone equal access to the important things in life: health, education, social services, protection from the vagaries of the market. But public services are under attack. Peter Bunting has given you detail about what it means. Full detail is in the annual report. And what we're going to have on 8th of July, tomorrow, is a further 12 billion of cuts to social security, mainly targeted on those people who are in work and who receive tax credits. Another attack on our members, and we have to respond. We have responded in the lead up to the 13th of March strike, and we need to build for further action. But we need to build and increase the number of trade unions that have been involved in it, and we need to build as well across both the public and the private sector. The interesting thing is that austerity, as you see from Greece, has the potential of destroying the European Union. It has the potential of destroying, in a smaller scale, the Northern Ireland peace process. Conference, Northern Ireland isn't a sovereign country. It's neither fish, flesh nor fowl. We're being told and treated as if we're a separate country with all the powers of a sovereign country. We're being told to balance the books, that our public sector is too big, that we need to increase the private sector and develop the private sector, and that we really need to get off our dependency on public services. But if you look at across other parts of the UK, it's clear that Northern Ireland isn't significantly out of kilter with those other under-deprived regions of the UK. They're very much like Northern Ireland. The Irish government, this motion says, has a critical role to play in forcing the British government to recognise that its austerity policies are likely to bring down the peace process, are likely to bring down the political institutions. And I suppose there's another comparison analogy with the Greek situation, in that they're saying on the one hand to Syriza and to the Greek people, you have to take your medicine, you have to get on with it. And that smugness that the President John Douglas referred to, our Irish politicians saying that the Greek people have to get on with it because if we did it, they did it. And to some extent, that has been the attitude of the coalition government in the Republic of Ireland to the negotiations that were taking place up in Belfast immediately prior to Christmas. Comments like, "You need a dose of austerity yourselves," from some of the ministers, and absolutely no sympathy that Northern Ireland has an independent case for no austerity. But we're not arguing for special treatment. We know that there are areas in Britain as well that deserve much better treatment, and we recognise our responsibility to build an anti-austerity movement, not only in Northern Ireland, but right across Britain, because this problem isn't solvable within the context of Northern Ireland. We need to build in Northern Ireland, and we need to take a stand against the cuts that are taking place in Northern Ireland. And like it or not, that is going to bring us into conflict in some shape or form with our Assembly, because we think that the elements of the Good Friday Agreement, for instance, the way in which £700 million is going to be invested in the rundown of public services, in around 20,000 redundancies for public servants, using a reinvestment and reform initiative to actually borrow money to reduce public services, doesn't seem to us in the trade union movement as a sensible way forward. And neither do we accept the case for a reduction in corporation tax. Now, we know that some people make the arguments that we're only seeking the power. That doesn't mean to say that we're seeking a reduction in corporation tax. But unfortunately, these things take a momentum of their own. And once the Assembly gets the power to reduce corporation tax, make no mistake about it, there will be pressure built up which will be almost inescapable to reduce the rate of corporation tax. Instead of targeting funding and finances at developing business, at developing research, and develop investment and economic development, what they're in fact doing by a reduction in corporation tax is giving a free handout to business. They are under no obligation to do anything about it. In fact, the facts, even as developed by and produced by PricewaterhouseCoopers in a report a number of years ago, they did a survey of businesses and firms, particularly in relation to foreign direct investment, and the rate of corporation tax was 17th in the list of factors which companies found it important whenever they were making decisions to invest. 17th. And yet we're told, certainly by our business lobby in Northern Ireland, that it's the only solution to Northern Ireland's economic problems. Conference, we recognise that the major problem in relation to public expenditure and in relation to austerity, in relation to the threat to the political institutions and arrangements in Northern Ireland, in relation to the threat to the peace process, lies with Westminster. But unfortunately, we also recognise that elements of the Stormont House Agreement are totally unacceptable to us, and that they were and are within the gift of our local politicians. Conference, I ask you to support this motion to demonstrate that the trade union movement in the whole of this island is concerned about the political arrangements and stability in Northern Ireland, and that we make a major point of putting pressure on both the British government, but in particular on the Irish government, to ensure that it plays its role to safeguard peace in Northern Ireland and to safeguard the future prosperity of the people. I move the motion.
I'd like to call on Patricia McKeown on behalf of the National Executive Council to second the motion, please.
Thank you, President. Delegates, Patricia McKeown, unison moving or seconding the motion on behalf of the Executive Council. We have 17 wasted years, and if we had risen to the challenges, then a child born on the day we said yes to the Good Friday Agreement would be living in a better world today. Instead, we have 17 years of unstable government. We have had 7 of those years constant suspensions of the Assembly. We have a Good Friday Agreement, which was a complex proposition put to the people, and more than 80% of us voted and 72% of us said yes, and that included majorities in the Nationalist, Republican and Unionist communities. and we are today in a worse position than we were 17 years ago. We're in a worse position in many respects, from life expectancy for the poorest people, to premature death rates, to attacks on our public services and attacks on our welfare system. But as Mick O'Reilly said this morning, that motion we carried needs to be nuanced for the North, because it is not a simple situation of orange and green. Our government is elected by us, the people. It doesn't function properly. And it doesn't function properly for one primary reason. The largest party refuses to accept the Good Friday Agreement and consequently dismisses all of the promises on equality and human rights. Those promises which would have delivered to us today civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. That party, the DUP, came into government in 2007 post the St Andrews Agreement. It said, there's an agreement we accept. But within the last few weeks, our allies, the CAJ, our human rights NGO, has had to go to court, take judicial review for the failure of our government to produce, as required by the St Andrews Agreement, an anti-poverty strategy. It has broken the law by not producing an anti-poverty strategy, and we haven't got one because it is resisted by the DUP. 4 years ago, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions mounted its campaign in the North against austerity. We in particular highlighted the dangers to our society of proposed welfare cuts. 3 political parties in our government agreed and came on side: Sinn Féin, the SDLP, and the Green Party. The other 3 parties in government, with various degrees of dogmatic response, rejected it, the strongest rejection coming from the DUP. In another world, that might be straightforward left-right politics, but it's not another world, it's where we live, in a complex situation with a difficult political setup and a government that can't function properly unless real pressure is brought to bear. And where should that pressure come from? It should come from the co-signatories of the Good Friday Agreement, the Irish government and the British government. And what did they do last December? Well, what did they do in 2007, indeed, when both governments changed? They walked away from us. They stopped exerting pressure to ensure that the commitments made to the people on equality and human rights were put into operation. And instead, we have the British government deciding to impose austerity and using the fact of a political crisis in the North to do that. And that is not only immoral, I think history will prove that that's one of the big mistakes of Irish history. The Irish government backed the proposal to cut our welfare system. That is an outrage. We need the Irish government to exert pressure on the British government to make sure that the Good Friday Agreement and the St Andrews Agreement are both implemented, and that the rights and the future of the people we represent are protected in the way that we were promised they would be protected. Peter's already outlined, as has Brian, the fact that our movement is resisting at every turn the attempt to deconstruct our welfare state. And there is no doubt that that is what the Tory government wants to do. But there is also a part of our own government that wants to do that. But that is not the view of the people who elect it. So in the complex situation we live in, we also, as a movement, have to exert pressure on all of the parties that form our enforced coalition. And I can tell you that in my own union, members who vote DUP, union activists who vote DUP, have been doing precisely that. Some of them are in that delegation with us today. And they have been exerting pressure on the people they vote for. They're entitled to vote for them, but they're also entitled that the people they vote for respect their wishes. And we know from all the polling done that everybody who votes for all of the political parties in the north, all the main parties who form the government, the majority of the electorate, 80% plus, have exactly the same message for our government. We want equality and human rights. We want them protected, and we want them now. And unfortunately, there are those who choose to divert the people's attention away from the real issues. In another 24 hours or less, a UK Chancellor will produce a budget that is likely, if it goes ahead as predicted, to hit us with another £1 billion worth of cuts immediately, plunge another 2,000 families in Northern Ireland into poverty, take £40 a week of another significant section of our working population, and cause further chaos. And we, the movement, must make sure that we are not having our attention diverted again by the raising of sectarianism. There's been a refusal by our current government to do an equality impact analysis of what will happen if those welfare cuts come in. They did a partial analysis, but they left out something key. They didn't analyse what the impact would be on the grounds of religion or religious belief or political opinion. They said they didn't know. We said, give us the addresses, we'll tell you the answer to that. Because the truth of the matter is that the patterns of discrimination in the north have not changed in 50 years, and the areas of greatest disadvantage are still the areas of greatest disadvantage, and the biggest hit will be on the poorest of the Catholic population. And because we live in a place that refuses to accept equality and human rights at its core, we have growing working class Protestant disadvantage. We in the movement say, we're not taking any more of that. We'll continue to stand up, and if that means that our government falls because some people stand up and do the right thing, so be it. We will continue to fight.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, motion 6. Any speakers on motion 6? Yes? Speaker motion 6, yeah? Yeah, well, certainly, yeah. Sorry, pardon.
Yeah, okay. Conference, Jeanette Murdoch on behalf of NIPSA to offer qualified support for the motion. And the qualification comes really in the first line where it says Congress endorses the anti-austerity campaign. Conference, I'm sorry to tell you, but at this moment in time there is no anti-austerity campaign in the north. We had a great campaign up until the 13th of March. Reps put their reputation on the line. We promised our members it wouldn't be another November the 30th when we march everybody up to the top of the hill and we leave them there. We promised them it wouldn't be one day of action, that it would be a campaign, it would be sustained, and we would fight for their jobs and our society. Unfortunately, Conference, we took our foot off the pedal, and in the mouth of a campaign or in the mouth of a general election. To be honest, Conference, that's unforgivable, and we need to look hard and study the mistake that was made there. But we can come back from it. We can build, and I would look to all the unions in the room to come together to work out a campaign that supports our members, supports our communities, where they are going to face the hits that are coming down the line at us. We need to make sure that we are totally behind our community and our members, and that we take it forward in a wholehearted campaign to defend what we have and keep our society. Conference, please support the motion, but go out from here and take it forward and have a sustained campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma.
President, delegates, guests, brothers and sisters, Paddy Michael, Belfast Trades Council, to speak in support of motion number 6. Comrades, if Greece has a specific message for workers across Europe and for unions in every state and country, it is this. Your voice is important. You can make a difference. Standing together, workers are stronger. Fighting together, we can take on the dirty, rotten, tax-avoiding, tax-evading, neoliberal capitalist parasites and their apologists and supporters. There is an alternative. There is an alternative. What we stand for is that alternative. When the Stormont House Agreement was published and the Stormont Castle Agreement was leaked, the trade union movement in the North came together to develop a strategy of opposition, particularly to the financial and economic aspects of those agreements. Unions, trades councils, and the Belfast Office of Congress organised dozens of public meetings in cities, towns, and villages. I'd like to place on record from this platform our appreciation for the hard work and dedication of Peter Bunting throughout that period. Quite often, union and Congress officials are dismissed simply as bureaucrats. Let me tell you, Peter Bunting was out doing public meetings, 2 to 3 meetings every night, every week, from January to March, until that March 13th strike. That is to be commended, and he should be commended for it on behalf of this movement. Comrades, it would be extremely misleading and factually wrong, and Jeanette covered that point earlier, to suggest that we have won any battle against austerity in the North. We haven't. But what we have done is we have given confidence to ordinary workers to stand up, to take to the streets. We have rejuvenated the movement in some areas, including in the community and voluntary sectors. We have provided the space for young trade unionists to again feel part of this aging movement. In many cases, they have shown the vision to challenge complacency in some areas. Belfast Trades Council salutes those unions who took strike action on the 13th of March, and those same unions and others who have also taken action short of strike action over the last number of months. But comrades, more is obviously needed. If we're to defeat the Tory-imposed austerity, welfare cuts and attack on public services, if we're to defeat the Assembly-imposed job cuts and fetish around corporate welfare in the form of corporation tax reductions for big businesses, if we are serious about taking on those anti-worker, ideologically driven social re-engineering experiments, we need to hold our nerve. We need to work across unions to encourage a coordinated and a sustained response. This needs to include further strikes. It needs to include other actions, protests. It needs to include engagement with political parties, and also critically developing links and joint strategies with our brothers and sisters in the Welsh, Scottish and TUC. We need to force the Irish government to deliver on their obligations as co-signatories and co-guarantors of the Belfast Agreement. As Podemos in Spain and the Syriza-led government in Greece and their powerful Oxy referendum campaign have demonstrated that people and ordinary workers can make a difference when they have the courage to stand up for themselves. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united will never be defeated. Support the motion.
Thank you, Paddy. Any other motions on, speakers on motion 6? Seeing none, we'll move on to motion number 7, opposition to austerity in the name of NIPSA. To propose and second that motion? Oh, sorry. There is a seconder. Can you come up to the front row?
Sisters and brothers, Carmel Gates, NIPSA, to propose motion 7. This motion has 2 very distinct parts, which are very clearly interlinked. The first one is about opposition to austerity and inequality, and the second one is about building and maintaining the unity of the working class in Ireland so that we can complete that battle against austerity. And I want to start by, as others have done, congratulating the workers of Greece, who twice this year have said no to austerity, first time by electing a left-wing government, the second time in the referendum. And I think we should congratulate those workers who stood against essentially the whole of corporate Europe, who stood against the banks, who stood against the bureaucrats, the European leaders, and said no. They stood against their own media, who threatened them that the banks were going to run out of money, their jobs were going to go, shops were going to close, old people were going to starve, and they still said no. And the reason they said no is they had nowhere else to go. No was the only thing that they could do, because they have nowhere further to fall. And I think we need to emulate, we need to congratulate, and we need to applaud. They tell us that what Greece did is bad for Europe. The only Europe it's bad for is the Europe of the 1%, the vulture capitalists, the banks, a Europe of greed. It's good for the Europe of democracy, it's good for the Europe of the 99%, and it's good for us. It doesn't matter that the papers are now saying that it's going to cost Ireland €1 billion because of what Greece did. We are international workers and we support each other, and their struggle is our struggle. But I have to say that I think Jennifer McCann said earlier, there's always more money, and we know that there is always more money. And if there isn't more money, then in the north of Ireland, we are in trouble, because we know that poverty fueled sectarianism for the last 30, 40 years. And unless we build against austerity in the north, we are going to face potentially that same nightmare of back to sectarianism. I think we have to learn from the past, and this movement has to learn from the past, because this movement has been split in the past. It was split in the 40s, when there was a division amongst British-based and Irish-based unions. What was partly a left-right split, but let's be realistic, was a split along nationalist lines. Our movement was also nearly split in the 1980s, when people called for an Ulster TUC, and again, it was clearly sectarian division, potentially growing within the movement. But we stood strong against it, comrades. We stood proud, and we stood for working class unity, and we fought back against the sectarians. Now, in recent times, there are those within our movement who say that we should align potentially with some of the political parties. But working class unity is not just an aspiration. In the north, it's a life and death issue. It's literally a life and death issue. And therefore, when people say that we should align with one or other political party, if they say to us, well, the DUP has based itself on the working class, and people like Sammy Wilson, who's now pro-austerity, used to be Red Sammy, or if they say, well, there's elements within the Ulster Unionist Party who see themselves as Labour Unionists, or they say to us, well, there's those within Sinn Féin who are anti-austerity, and therefore we must align ourselves with them and build alliances with them. I have to say, comrades, the peace in the north is too fragile for us to engage in politics that would bring us into alignment with organisations who are seen to be voted on by one community or seen to represent one community. We need the political independence of the trade union movement in Ireland. We need the political independence of the trade union movement in the north. And therefore, I would urge every sensible trade unionist hall, ensure the independence of the trade union movement. Build a movement that is ours, that is a class-based movement, a movement that is built on the unity of the working class, and do not allow ourselves to be aligned with any parties that workers north or south of the border will see as sectarian. Support the motion.
Seconder for the motion, please.
Brothers and sisters, Billy Lynn Nipsa to second the motion. And I'm not getting at any specific political party or political individual, but it sickens me to death to hear some of our local politicians standing up and saying that they're anti-austerity, and then they vote in the Assembly for pro-austerity measures. They voted in the Assembly, they cut the public service pension scheme so that our members have to work longer and pay more. They have cut and voted, all the political parties, to cut the compensation scheme in the public sector, which means if you're made redundant, your actual compensation is cut. And particularly at a time whenever the DUP and Sinn Féin have signed up to the Stormont House Agreement, I know it's a separate motion, where they have borrowed £700 million from the Reform and Reinvestment Fund in order to cut 20,000 jobs. That's pro-austerity. Anti-austerity would be to borrow £700 million to create 20,000 jobs. That is real anti-austerity. You know, in my area of the public sector, the cuts are real. They're happening now. They're happening at this minute. This year, in my area, 2,500 jobs will go out the door. They will be away. Come September this year, starting in September, 800 jobs, over 800 jobs will go. That is not anti-austerity. That is pro-austerity. But I agree with Carmel. It's essential that we maintain the unity of the trade union movement and we maintain the unity of the working class, not just in the north, but north and south and internationally. And we have to continue to oppose sectarianism, because as you know, in Northern Ireland, everything becomes sectarianised. Even, I was going to say even flags, but even foreign flags become sectarianised, as we know. You can't say you're anti-austerity and then vote for pro-austerity measures. It's the old saying, you can't ride two horses with the same bum. You're either one or the other. What I'm going to say next, I haven't discussed with the General Secretary, but maybe we should take a leaf out of the book of Greece. Maybe we should have a referendum, north and south, on austerity, whether we're for austerity or against austerity, so that the ordinary people of Ireland, north and south, can make that decision. And I know what that decision will be. It will be exactly the same decision as in Greece. It will be Archie. It will be no. It will be nil. Or if you come from Ballymoney, it will be no.
Deirdre MacDonald, ASTI. As I listened today to the various speakers, I found myself in total agreement with everything that was being said. And the real joy of this motion, as we are an all-Ireland organisation, is that it refers to austerity in north and south, east, west, as in whether you go to Spain or Greece or whatever. Austerity is austerity. But when do good words become mere rhetoric? I respectfully suggest, fellow trade unionists, that when they are not followed up by action. Therefore, Congress, I propose that now is the time for us to plan our action, to change our rhetoric into action. Talk is cheap. We have stood idly by while the government policies have brought about growing inequity in our society. Corporate structures that will facilitate privatisation of our water infrastructure. Huge increases in child poverty. While a government continues to give tax relief for property speculation after coming into office. And as trade unionists, while governments fail to significantly improve the working conditions and rights of workers, workers that as time goes by will have to work for far longer than their retired peers. Please, let us stop the rhetoric. Let us start the action. Actions speak louder than words. I ask Congress, as the motion does, how are we going to bring about the changes that we want? And when are we going to do it? Thank you.
Tommy McGlone, NTO. Delegates, whenever we think of austerity, we don't always think of it in the local sense. We tend to look elsewhere, to the likes of Greece or Spain. And when we do, we see that the sectarian divide that exists in the north pales. It is right that this motion in the last section asks that we should ensure that the trade union movement is not too closely identified with political movements. But really, it is not us who uses these sectarian labels. They are not important to our values. What is important is that we take a principled stand against austerity regardless. The austerity cuts to the education budget in Northern Ireland mean that schools face job cuts that will result in a loss of 800 teaching posts. We have already lost all the young signature project teachers, and now with the loss of more teaching posts, schools face the prospect of overcrowded classrooms. The funding for classroom assistants and the support staff that is needed to help the most vulnerable pupils in our schools continues to be under threat. The finance needed to properly resource schools and provide our teachers and children with the modern tools and equipment essential to learn and to keep up with our European neighbours is under threat. The resources needed to maintain the schools and keep them warm, welcoming places for our children, along with the resources needed for special needs provision, breakfast clubs, extracurricular after-schools clubs, homework clubs, school meals and transport is under threat. However, from INTO's point of view, campaigning and resisting the austerity agenda alone will not improve the prospects of our future generations. INTO calls on Congress to demand investment in education as the key economic driver essential to secure a better future for the children in schools today rather than the future they currently face. Education needs union involvement and leadership. This can't come solely from the INTO. Congress must persuade and encourage all activists from the different teaching unions in the North to campaign in their schools and wider community. Only with their participation can we truly ensure that the fight against austerity is seen as cross-community. When Nick Ictu called a day of action in March, the teachers and public service workers from the Falls Road and Sandy Row melted into one parade as they made their way to the rally at the City Hall. These workers from different sides of Belfast were united in their opposition to austerity, and they continue to be united in their opposition to austerity because it is having a negative impact on their everyday lives. For their sake, INTO was proud to support this motion.
Thank you. Seeing no more speakers on motion number 7, we're moving on to motion number 8 in the name of the PCS, Coordinated Action on Pay. Is the proposer and seconder from the PCS here, please? Can you move to the front?
Conference, Barney Lawn, PCS, moving motion 8. I think it's great that we've seen, shall we say, the whole gathering together and identifying. I think that there is action, and I think action needed in the future. I know as part of our own union, we've been certainly, PCS have been a front liner in taking on the Tory government. And yeah, we have paid our price, we've paid our dues, but that didn't mean that it was set back and didn't continue the fight, and we will continue to do so. And I think within this motion here, what we're looking for is that we have the support and the wider concept of the trade union movement working as one, I suppose, in isolation. We all know with the outcome of the UK election, the Tory ideology has been very clear. It's cuts, cuts and more cuts, which they aim to implement as quickly and as harshly as possible. And I think tomorrow's budget will bear fruit to that statement. The only real opposition to the austerity is the trade union movement. We know this, but they also know it. That's why they're trying to introduce new legislation to make strike action more difficult in general and in some areas nearly impossible. The only way the trade union movement can defeat the austerity agenda, protect public services, welfare and terms and conditions is by working together in unity and fighting like we've never fought before. We need to commit ourselves to opposing the cuts, privatisation, anti-union legislation and further attacks on pay and pensions. Austerity is an ideological choice. It's not a fiscal necessity. We all know that it hasn't worked to date. The deficit was supposed to be eradicated. It's still 90 billion. The debt that Osborne said would be 67.4% of GDP now is actually 80.2%. Yeah, the cuts and the misery are very real for the majority of society. It's all pain and no gain. Except, of course, for those at the top, the richest 1% or so, have continued to do very well, helped by Osborne cutting 50% tax rate to 45%. Members' take-home pay has also been affected by increased pension contributions and their living standards driven down. Cuts to local services impacting on the widest of society, hiking VAT to 20%, cuts to tax credits and other in-work benefits. In fact, some public sector workers are 20% worse off a year following real-term cuts and pay and pension increases. What's the motivation? The public sector pay freeze and now the cap is about balancing the books and the backs of dedicated public servants, and it's about driving down wages to make public services more attractive for privatisation. That means joint coordinated industrial action with joint demands and a joint strategy. The public sector pay cap is a public sector-wide policy, and it can only be defeated by us being united together in action in our demands and in our strategy. Congress, support the motion. Let's work together to defeat the public sector pay cap and get a fair deal for our members. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Barney. Is seconder for that motion? Formally? Okay. Look, we're just going to proceed to try and get the rest of the motions in this section finished. So if people who are moving motions could come up to the front. So I'll have the mover of motion number 9 in the name of NIPSA. You want to speak on this one? Go ahead.
Nearly not getting speaking. Sisters and brothers, Lucia Collins, NIPSA fully supporting and endorsing PCS's call out to unions for a coordinated strategy on pay and pensions. Comrades, this has been our continued fight, and many times over the last few years we have risen to the challenge, and we must avoid being left there again. We must avoid that happening again. Our democratic socialist principles make us as trade unionists never to give up, never to stop being positive that we're doing everything we can to rebuild the movement. The motion concentrates on getting an early message out to everyone in this conference of what each one of us need to do, north, south and UK-wide. How many times do we talk about developing a strategy and not delivering? We had a strategy, we delivered, we brought thousands out on March the 13th. We tried to keep that momentum up so we could deliver again prior to the general election. That didn't happen, but it doesn't mean that we won't rise to the occasion again. We have to be thankful for unions that keep bringing motions to platforms where we can highlight the difficulties and develop policies to continue to kick the message home. We must do that every time if that's what needs to be done. Also, these policies endorsed by our members need to be implemented by all of the trade union leadership. I didn't write my speech until I listened to the President's address, and I welcome that he's saying what all the union members on the ground are saying. He called for a joint, united, cross-community opposition platform to Tory austerity cuts. But we must also recognise that these are Assembly in Northern Ireland and Tory austerity cuts that have adversely impacted on us, and we cannot shy away from the fight back. To that speaker from Dublin Trades Council who said do not exclude certain sections who can work for a better future, who said that Northern Ireland is only an administration, I'd ask you, why would you embrace austerity parties? What difference does that make when in Northern Ireland 77 MLAs voted to cut our pensions, diminish our compensation scheme and created an impact we're feeling more every day in our pockets? Every public sector union member is feeling this impact. For the civil service, the reality of the Stormont House Agreement is now that they're coming for our jobs. This is a class issue. The Assembly, as previous speakers have said, will borrow $700 million to make 20,000 civil servants redundant. Working class people and jobs that we will never get back. The next period will cause economic devastation that can only be opposed by a proper political fight back on the ground, out in the streets, in the communities, and especially in the trades councils. NIPSA is mandated to take strike action, mandated to link up to willing unions. So let's endorse the PCS strategy and draw up a plan that all unions can be mandated. Let all the trade unions be responsible for developing a strategy. Let's start with a 24-hour general strike against their problem of of a system built for nothing, only the search for profit. Let's build a strategy of a coalition of willing unions to match and beat the general election of Tory and Assembly capitalists. Comrades, please support the motion.
Thank you, sir. Okay, I'm going to call on the mover of motion number 9, Stormont House Agreement, NIPSA.
Okay, Alison Miller on behalf of NIPSA to move motion number 9. Conference, while NIPSA had for a long time warned of the devastating impact of the backloading of the cuts contained within the 4-year comprehensive spending review, it came as a shock to many to fully realise what this would mean for jobs and public services. When the 2015-16 budget was published, it became a stark reality what the implications for our public services and public service jobs would be. It is a reality that if implemented, our public services will never be the same again. On top of this, we have a situation whereby tomorrow George Osborne will deliver his 8th of July budget, which will see further cuts to the Northern Ireland Block Grant and further devastating cuts to hard-working families by cuts to working families' tax credits, child tax credits, to somewhere in the tune of £12 billion. In addition, it is expected that this budget will see further attacks on the sick and the disabled by further attacks on unemployment support allowance, reducing it to the level of job seekers allowance. Conference, we condemn the Northern Ireland executive parties for the financial elements of the Stormont House Agreement, which will ultimately see 20,000 public sector jobs lost, not just now, but for future generations, and with it a further 6,000 to 10,000 jobs lost from the private sector. This will devastate the public services and will devastate the communities in which we live, who rely on the services delivered by many of our members. Conference, the financial elements of the Stormont House Agreement are ludicrous, with the Northern Ireland Executive borrowing over £700 million over the next 4 years to effectively make public servants redundant. This will have to be repaid, and in the end, we will be poorer as a result, with less public services that we all rely on our day-to-day lives disappearing. We already have witnessed street lightings not being replaced, grass cutting only being done once a year, school teachers and support staff being made redundant, and I could go on and on. Conference, there is an onslaught on public services, public service jobs, and the Stormont House Agreement also seeks to press forward with the key sell-off of public service assets, such as TransLink, Belfast Harbour and Northern Ireland Water. It is vital that if the politicians come after our public services, then we must go after them and seek to use all the weapons at our disposal to defend our public services and our public service jobs. Conference, we have witnessed already the impacts of creeping privatisation in many areas of our public services, such as health. What does this actually mean in reality? The staff are generally paid less and have lesser terms and conditions, and the poor with no pensions. It is often claimed that the private sector can deliver public services better. What rubbish! Where is the evidence for this? They may deliver the services cheaper, although I would say that is highly questionable, but where they do this is at the expense of the workers delivering the service, who are often on minimum wage and low-paid jobs. The private sector is therefore making a profit. They are not doing it because they believe in the public sector. They are seeking to make a fast buck off the back of the sick, the vulnerable, our children, our elderly, and they must not be allowed to do it in our name. Conference, there's also the issue of corporation tax, which many in the private sector and our political masters believing that this will somehow bring inward investment to Northern Ireland and grow the private sector. This is despite the growing bank of evidence that the corporation tax will not grow the private sector, but it will further deplete the public sector by somewhere between 300 million and 600 million, depending on who you listen to. However, if we look at this part of the island of Ireland, where is the evidence that the lower rate of corporation tax has created additional jobs or attracted one piece of foreign direct investment? What it has created is many more plaques on the doors of empty offices, and this has been used as a tax haven for unscrupulous companies. Conference, there's an onslaught on our public services, which will need an effective and strong campaign to build our opposition. And while the public sector strikes involving 5 unions on the 13th of March was an important day, it was only the start. Conference, I would call on ICTU to reinvigorate an effective public service defence campaign so that in the future years we will have public service to be proud of, to hand over to our children, our grandchildren and further generations. Conference, I move.
Thank you, Alison. Is there a second for the motion? Thank you. Speaking? Yeah. No.
Padraig Mahal, Nipsa, second motion number 9. First of all, I was wondering, was Jennifer still in the hall? It's a pity. I was going to say, Jennifer, will you please stop implementing the cuts? Conference, we need to be clear in this hall. Not one of the fundamental issues affecting Northern Ireland or this island has been resolved. The national question remains unresolved. Sectarianism remains right. And repression continues to haunt us daily in Northern Ireland. We are a society in a political crisis. We are a society that has been failed by the politicians and by the political institutions that tend towards reinforcing sectarianism rather than resolving it. And to then, comrades, take that crisis and heap austerity on top of it is madness. To then heap on top of austerity some local growing additional austerity through a cut in corporation tax is absolute madness. And when you apply madness to a political situation, there is a price to be paid. That price comes in lost jobs, destruction of education services, no homes, a health crisis, services run into the ground, and the collapse even of the private sector. But comrades, on top of that price, there is another one. It is the price of a future of violence and conflict, because we should have no doubt about it. When the Tories and the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Dáil implement austerity in this island, they throw fuel onto the fire of conflict. They add to the potential for conflict. They tell a generation there is no way out. They tell a generation there is no future, and young people turn to old, tried and tested and failed methods. They try the bullet and the bomb again. So, comrades, we have to find an alternative. We have to present something else. What we have to say is build the peace, stop the cuts, give young people a future, and fight back against austerity. Support the motion.
Thank you. Other speakers? I just asked all speakers just to be conscious of the time. We are running a little bit behind time, so when the red light goes on, you're finished. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. Mark Walsh, ASTI Executive. I just wanted to speak on this because it reminds me very much, the figures even are very reminiscent of what happened in the South. If you think of, it says here in the motion that 20 to 30,000 public servants are due to be let go in Northern Ireland or made redundant. The same figures actually happened in the South. 30,800 people were gotten rid of from the public sector. 320,400 down to 289,600. That's a reduction of 10% in the public sector figures. Also, the pay bill, the so-called pay bill, as if it's a bill given to somebody that they don't like for public sector workers, has been reduced by 20% since 2009, from 17.5 billion in 2009 to 13.9 billion now. And the shocking fact is, and I know people from our comrades from the north here are appealing for support, but the shocking fact is that those reductions, 10% in numbers and 20% in pay, have been achieved in the south with the cooperation of the trade unions within ICTU, with the cooperation of ICTU. Not with the opposition, with the cooperation and participation of ICTU unions. How? Through Croke Park 1, Haddington Road, and it rolls on now into the Lansdowne Road agreement. That is what ICTU and the unions within ICTU who are in favour of all these deals are doing to the public sector. They're helping to cut pay and cut numbers. And I just want to say to delegates from the north that if you're appealing to ICTU in the south to help you, beware what you're asking for, because you may be told to go in and negotiate some agreement with the Northern Ireland Executive to cut voluntarily rather than have it imposed on you, to volunteer to cut it yourself. So just beware what you ask for. I clearly support people who want to fight back in the North, but just beware of asking for help. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Any more speakers on motion 9? No more speakers. We're going to move on to motion number 10. In the name of Unison, supporting the Northern Ireland peace process. So can the mover of that motion please take to the... Thank you.
Thank you. Conference President Dennis Keating's Unison moving motion 10 on the Northern Ireland peace process. The trade union movement has long supported the peace process in Northern Ireland, and this motion is asking for support again at a critical time. I want to start with some positives. Northern Ireland has the highest trade union density in the UK. Our buses are public, our trains are public, our water is public. There are no privatised support service contracts in health, and there is no privatisation in our education system. When we last took strike action on the 13th of March, an online opinion poll run by a hostile newspaper returned a result of 89% of the public in support of public services taking strike action. On Saturday the 13th of June, 20,000 people marched through the streets of Belfast in support of equality and civil marriage. Whilst these are things to celebrate, they are clearly seen as a major threat by the Tory government and their allies in the DUP. So it came as no surprise then that the Stormont House Agreement, brokered in the mouth of Christmas last year, with the explicit involvement of the British government and the tactical support of the Irish government, was used as an opportunity to impose structural adjustment upon us. Consequently, 20,000 public service jobs are to be deleted. Financial penalties have been imposed on the block grant because half of our political parties support the trade union position in opposition to welfare cuts. Our entire political system, again, is on the brink. I want to take this opportunity to call for someone in authority in the Labour Party to call to account the current Shadow Secretary of State, Ivan Lewis, who is continually advocating that our party support the welfare cuts and public service cuts. He is a disgrace and he should be disciplined by his own party. What we are seeking in this motion is not easy. 17 years on, we still do not have a Bill of Rights or an agreed process for dealing with the past, and we're still very much a society emerging from conflict. You tend not to hear about the resurgence of bombing and shootings, but they're very much still with us. We could have hoped for a different government to lobby in this motion, but we still have to confront the current British government with a demand that it lives up to its commitments under an international peace treaty and ceases to destabilise the peace process by viciously imposing austerity. I hope you can all support this motion. Thank you.
Is there a seconder for the motion, or is it formally seconded? Seconder for the motion. Thank you.
Delegates, President Margaret McKee Unison, second motion 10 on the peace process. Over the past year, my union, Unison, has been part of mass protests against our dysfunctional government, growing racism and racist violence, attacks on public services, welfare benefits and pay, and will continue to do so. Now we're witnessing homophobic attacks are on the increase, and the worst and most persistent violence is against women. However, the elephant in the room is sectarianism and sectarian violence. In our deeply divided society, challenging prejudice, bigotry and sectarianism is at the core of what we have to do as a society if there is to be a genuine peace process and justice and equality for future generations. This is precisely what our government has failed to do. This has been aided and abetted by the UK government, which in itself demonstrates a deep disrespect for equality and human rights, and has now turned its attention to attacking the poor and the low paid. As trade unionists, we continue to take to the streets to protest about a government which will continually demonstrate its inability to agree on the core evils that divide us. There is no agreed legal definition of sectarianism in Northern Ireland, and if we cannot define the oppression, then we cannot properly challenge or eliminate it. Unison and our allies have sponsored an initiative to produce an agreed definition and press our government to take it seriously. The trade union movement is at the forefront of the campaign for the unfinished business and the Good Friday Agreement to be completed. That includes a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland as promised.
It requires a process for dealing with the past so we can move forward in the future. And it requires institutional and systemic promotion of real equality of opportunity. Instead, there has been an almost total rollback on these fundamental commitments in the Good Friday Agreement. The current UK government has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted to fulfil its role as co-signatory of an international peace treaty with the Irish government. During the talks on the Stormont House Agreement, the Irish government also let us down by joining the Tory call and the Labour Party call for welfare reform to be part of the talks. It does seem that the poor, the low-paid and the marginalised in this society are once again being scapegoated by the political process. I live in one of the most socially deprived areas in Europe, North Belfast, where unemployment, closure of schools, lack of social housing, poor mental health and suicide is part of our everyday life. Drug barons and gangsters are sucking the very lifeblood of our young people. This is the impact of poverty and cuts in my community. Northern Ireland needs investment in people and services, not cuts. We need the commitment of the whole trade union movement in this island to work for equality, justice and peace for the people of the 6 counties. I second.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers on motion 10?
President, Conference, Maria Morgan from NIPSA to support motion 10, and primarily because it's in relation to the country that we all live in the north day and daily, and the potential that we can see for what can happen coming into the weeks and the months ahead. And I say that in particular in relation to the welfare cuts, post-conflict. That's the society that we are. There are high levels of suicide, there are high levels of mental health issues that are a legacy of the conflict from which we're emerging, and we can't forget that. And that's one of the very proud reasons that I think that this movement, and particularly the Northern Ireland Committee, have opposed very vigorously the welfare cuts coming from the Tories and coming out of the Assembly. Just want to make a point as well about the borrowing in the Stormont House Agreement to make 20,000 public sector jobs redundant. That is one of the central planks of the Stormont House Agreement. However, if we drill down into it and take, for instance, as an example, in the area that I represent, NIPSA, in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, 2,500 jobs are to go in 1 year, the 15-16 budget year. And how they're getting rid of the workers in those jobs is to use a ranking system where the cheapest will go. And the cheapest will be the people at the older end of the scale, but also the younger end of the scale. And that is how they're going to find how you get rid of workers cheaply. But what that means is young people may take that because it's voluntary before it becomes compulsory, and they might take that redundancy and go now. But what it also means is they are jobs that we will never get back. So young people coming out of school won't have those public sector jobs to go into, primarily the 2,500 in the civil service this year, but fundamentally the 20,000 public sector jobs that will go over the next year or going into 2 years. Finishing this, President, we have a very volatile situation in the north. Tomorrow, the Chancellor of the Exchequer will give us a further budget, 12 billion welfare cuts, 13 billion that will have to be found across departments. And if that won't set the touchlight to conflict and the potential for young people in our society in the north and across these islands feeling they are on the scrap heap with no alternative but to the old and as tried and tested and failed methods, then I don't know what will. So please support the motion.
Thank you, Maria. Seeing no more speakers on motion number 10, we're now moving. Oh, is there? Sorry, apologies. Let's see you over there. Go ahead.
Colleagues, Paul Byron, GMB. Without the support of the region, I have to say. Colleagues, President, you know, at the end of the day, it's okay standing up here and criticising the politicians, and I'm not here. It's going to be an unpopular statement to make, but there's only so much certain politicians can do with the confines of financial difficulties that's within the remit of organisations. You mean, so while I totally support the motion, I have to say to you, colleagues, there's a lot of politicians who support public services, and and Peter here will back me in saying the only way to make the difference is to join the GMB. So support the motion.
After that ad for the GMB, we're going to move swiftly on to motion number 11. Can I move for motion number 11 in the name of NASUWT? Thank you. Sorry, Justin.
Thank you. Justin McCampbell, NASUWT. Comrades, I bring this motion to you to highlight the continuing sectarian nature of education in Northern Ireland and how vested interests have manipulated the make-up of our education authority to exclude any representation from trade unions or anyone else from the community sector. Who are the vested interests who have carved up power in education in Northern Ireland? Two groups, the churches and the academic selection lobby. When the already imperfect legislation went before Stormont, this body was to have 20 members, including 4 community representatives. Public advertisements had been placed and applications had been received, including from many trade unionists, when a last-minute amendment to the legislation was passed in Stormont, removing these places and replacing them with representatives of the Irish medium sector, the integrated sector, the controlled grammar schools, and the voluntary grammar schools. And because controlled schools are controlled by the trustees of the main Protestant churches, an extra place, of course, had to be created for the Catholic Council for Maintained Schools. This is a public body with no community representation. In effect, trade unionists, teacher training colleges, academics, assessment bodies, the voluntary sector, parents, community groups are permanently excluded from representation. Let me describe the current makeup. Of a total membership of 21, 1 chair, 8 politicians. Who ever heard of 8 politicians? Who ever heard of politicians making themselves a minority? 4 persons nominated by the Transferrer Representatives Council. Now, this is the politically correct way in Northern Ireland of saying 4 Protestants. 4 persons nominated by the Northern Ireland Commission for Catholic Education. Politically correct way of saying there's the 4 Catholic church places. 1 Irish medium, I fully support that. And 1 integrated, again, no issues there. 1 person representing the interests of the controlled grammar schools. This is our politically correct way of saying this is the middle class Protestants. 1 person representing the interests of the voluntary grammar schools. This body is in reality a political lobby group whose sole purpose is to maintain academic selection and entrench the middle class nature of the grammar school system. One of the worst aspects of the grammar school sector having representation on the Education Authority is that the Education Authority has no remit over the grammar school sector, but the grammar school representatives will be deciding on policy for every other type of school. These people fought to the bitter end to ensure that individual grammar schools would remain as individual employing authorities. They have ensured that they individually have the right to set terms and conditions for their non-teaching staff. The grammar sector, with the support of right-wing politicians, have ensured that an all-encompassing Education and Skills Authority did not get off the ground. They fought the battle to the right to opt out of agreed terms and conditions for staff and to ensure that they had the right to continue with academic selection for allocating pupil places at their schools. I know not everyone here may have supported the establishment of the ESA, but this is not the focus of this motion. This motion is about rejecting the sectarian carve-up of the administration of education in the North. It is about rejecting the bizarre situation where the churches have more representatives on the board of this authority than the politicians who are meant to hold the board to account on behalf of us, the public who voted for them, or not voted for them in some cases. It is about rejecting the idea that we need separate Catholic and Protestant bodies to run our schools. It is about accountability. It is fundamentally unfair that representatives of voluntary grammars will be able to influence decisions affecting every other school in Northern Ireland, despite having ensured that they are not under the control or influence of this body themselves. They cannot have it both ways. They should be 100% in or 100% out. It is about rejecting a body which entrenches class divisions, by giving a voice to those groups who exist only to support academic selection. Vote for the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Is there a second to the motion? Thank you.
Teresa Graham, NASUWT, to second the motion. Colleagues, the education system in Northern Ireland is not entirely, but is mostly divided on religious grounds. Poll after poll shows that most people are not happy with this situation. Integrated education in Northern Ireland has been put on the back burner, and secular education has always been a non-starter. But it should not be like this. It is a reflection of the failure of our politicians in Northern Ireland that when an attempt was made to subsume the role of the body responsible for Catholic schools into a wider Education and Skills Authority, the politicians ended up backing a system that not only retained that body, but created a Protestant body for schools as well. The legislation setting up the Education Authority placed an onus on it to promote shared education. I believe that trade union and community representatives would have held the Education Authority to account on this issue. For let's face it, no one else on the Education Authority will have any interest in doing so. This is an issue that affects all of us in this island, as we must make serious efforts to ensure the growth of integrated and shared education in Northern Ireland, or we will set the prospect of genuine reconciliation back further, with implications for the whole island. Promoting shared education should not be the preserve of some benevolent American philanthropist, but should involve all involved in education. This is not essentially a debate about budget cuts. However, the Education Authority will be the means by which cuts to schools and essential services for young people will be delivered, so we can fight these cuts together. I accept that the original Education and Skills Authority was not perfect, but what we have now in the Education Authority is a body that is already badly in need of reform. We must send a message to our politicians that the message they have sent to the public through the creation of the Education Authority is that, primarily, education is a matter for church and not a matter for state. The Northern Ireland Executive must go back to the drawing board and create a public body for education that reflects the public. Create a body that guarantees representation for workers, parents and the wider community. Create a body to end division, not entrench it. Create a body which ends academic selection, not promote it. Create a body which ends the rights of individual schools to set their own terms and conditions for workers, and stop such schools from promoting such ideas within an educational authority, and hence to the Northern Ireland Executive, where, unfortunately, there is always a willingness among some politicians to listen to a gospel that preaches lower pay and poor conditions as a good message. Colleagues, I urge you to vote for this motion.
Thank you very much. Okay, any speakers to motion 11? There is one speaker. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
President. Conference, Brian Booth on behalf of NIPSA to seek remission of motion number 11. Brothers and sisters, the reason we seek remission is due to the second sentence in the motion, which states, Conference believes that the rejection of an all-embracing Education Skills Authority represents a sadly missed opportunity. My union does not believe that the formation of an Education Skills Authority will resolve or create anything. Rather, we believe the formation of ESA will lead to an opportunity for the likes of Gavin Boyd, the Minister, and the employers to introduce widespread centralisation and become a vehicle to introduce further swingeing cuts in service and jobs for our members. Just last week, last Friday, there was an announcement of hundreds of job losses in education in the north, in schools. Conference, I would ask NASUWT to consider accepting remission and allow this motion to be kicked back to the Executive Committee to take out only this one line and implement the terms of the rest of the motion. The removal of this line, this sentence, does not affect the terms of the motion in any way. So, brothers and sisters, don't send the wrong signal to Gavin Boyd, to the Minister, to the employers. Conference, remit this motion. Thanks.
Is there a second for the motion to remit?
Madam President, Chairman. I'm not seconding. No, I'm speaking to the motion.
Speaking to the motion. Is there a second for the remission motion? Formally seconded.
Are you voting that?
No, not yet. No.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. The establishment of the Education Authority in the North is, as has been described in the motion, a matter of profound regret. The INTO had wanted to see the original, that is the 2008 version of ESA established, the Education and Skills Authority. Unfortunately, a failure to achieve agreement amongst the executive parties at Stormont on the proposal made that, the creation of a single employing authority, impossible. The real regret here is that the reality of 5 years of administrative paralysis that resulted from the political failure. Over these years, INTO and our colleagues in the other unions representing workers in the education sector were subjected to endless prevarication on the part of the Department of Education and employers who were unwilling to make decisions in advance